She was 18 years old and standing in a scrapyard with a single silver dollar in her palm and nowhere left in the world to spend it. There was no home behind her to go back to. There was no family left to claim her, and no letter of introduction, and no trade she could put her name to that anyone in that town had asked for. Just a dollar, and a canvas satchel with 2 dresses folded inside it, and a small brass hand level that had belonged to a man who was no longer living. With that dollar, she bought a rusted mine cart nobody else in the yard would touch. A dead man's cart, the auctioneer called it, and laughed when he said it, because dead men's carts were not worth bidding on. Because underneath the ore bed of that cart, wound twice around the axle and padlocked to the frame, was a chain that had been put there for a reason, and because whoever had put it there had known exactly what he was hiding, and exactly who he was hiding it for, and that the girl standing in the mud with her last dollar already spent would be the only person in 3 years to think the chain was worth cutting. Settle in and stay close, and before we go any further, let us know down in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Mara Doyle had been born in a 2-room frame house behind the assay office of a copper camp called Ember Gulch, the only child of a mine surveyor named Elias Doyle, and a seamstress named Constance, who took in mending from half the bachelors in the district, because a surveyor's wage did not stretch as far as a family needed it to. For the first 10 years of her life, she had believed, without ever needing to say so, that the small, warm world behind that assay office was the shape the whole world took. Her father went down into the workings most mornings before the light, carrying a transit and a notebook and a plumb bob wound in oilcloth, and he came home at dusk smelling of candle smoke and wet rock, and he would sit her on the edge of the porch and let her hold the level while he explained why a bubble that sat dead center meant a beam was true, and a bubble that drifted meant somebody somewhere had cheated the grade. Her mother taught her to read by the stove in the evenings, out of a primer with a torn cover, and she had a way of tapping the page when Mara got a word right that made Mara feel she had done something clever even when she had only sounded out a name. The typhoid came through Ember Gulch in the autumn of Mara's 10th year, carried in on the drinking water from a flooded lower level nobody had thought to test, and it took her mother in 6 days and her father in 10. When it was over, Mara was standing in the yard behind the assay office in a dress that no longer fit her, watching 2 men from the Miners' Aid Society load a wagon, and there was no one left in the little frame house but her. Her father had been, by every account she ever heard afterward from men who had worked under him, the fairest surveyor the district had known, the kind of man who would walk a grade 3 times over rather than sign a figure he was not certain of, even when a company boss stood at his elbow wanting a different number written down. He had told her once, on the porch step with the level between them, that a man who lies about a grade to please his employer will one day lie about something that gets a man killed, and that the 2 kinds of lying were not as far apart as people liked to believe. She had not understood it at 10 years old. She would come to understand it a great deal better before she turned 18. She was taken in that same week by her father's older brother, a wheelwright and hoist mechanic named Silas Doyle, who had never married, and who lived alone above his own shop at the edge of a mining town called Blackrock, 30 miles east along the spur line. Silas was a broad, slow-spoken man with a burned scar across one forearm and hands permanently stained the color of iron filings, and he did not know what to do with a grieving child, and so he did the only thing he knew how to do, which was to teach her the work of his hands. For 8 years he taught her, patiently and without much speech, and she learned. She learned to true a wheel and reset a bearing and read the wear on a brake shoe the way other girls her age read a hemline. She learned to judge the load a cart could carry by the give in its floorboards, and to hear, from the pitch of a wheel on iron rail, whether a bushing had gone dry. She learned to set a level across a mine floor and read the bubble to a hair's width, and to spot, in a shored drift, the one prop that had been cut too thin by a foreman looking to save on timber. She learned the honest weight of an ore car by the sound its bed made when you rapped it with a knuckle, and she learned the dishonest tricks a lazy carman used to shave a haul and still get paid for a full one. Patience with iron was a lesson Silas never called a lesson at the time, though it was exactly the temperament a person needed to work iron for a living without losing heart over it. Iron did not hurry for anyone, Silas told her once, turning a hot rivet with a pair of tongs while she pumped the bellows, and a person who tried to force a piece of iron to move faster than it wanted to move only bent what should have stayed straight, or broke what should have stayed whole. The same was true, he said, of most things worth having, though he did not explain himself further, and she did not ask him to, because Silas Doyle was not a man who explained himself twice. She came to understand, over the years at his bench, that he was speaking as much about the 2 years of grief that had followed her parents' deaths as he was about any wheel or axle, and that his manner of teaching her patience with iron had been, all along, his manner of teaching her patience with everything else a hard life asked a person to carry. On slow winter evenings, when the shop had no work in it, and the two of them sat by the stove with cups of chicory coffee going cold between them, Silas sometimes talked about the mines themselves. In the plain, unhurried way he talked about everything, and told her which foreman in Blackrock could be trusted to shore a drift properly, and which ones cut corners the company never noticed, until a roof came down on a man who had trusted the wrong foreman's timber count. He told her that a good wheelwright kept his ears open in that town, because half his business came from company men who wanted a cart, repaired quietly rather than reported, and the other half came from miners who wanted the truth about a piece of equipment from somebody who had no stake in lying to them about it. She listened to all of it the way she had once listened to her father read figures out of a freight ledger, turning the pages of a different kind of book. And by the time she was 17, she understood the mining trade in that country nearly as well as any man twice her age who had gone down into a shaft to earn the knowledge firsthand. Silas carried in the breast pocket of his coat a small brass hand level with a chipped glass vial and a bubble that always settled true, given to him by a millwright he had apprenticed under as a boy. And when Mara was 15, he pressed it into her palm one evening at the workbench and closed her fingers around it and said only, "You'll want to know when a thing is level and when it only looks that way." And after that, the level was hers. He died in the winter of her 18th year, quietly, at the workbench with a half-finished wheel spoke still clamped in the vise, his hands folded in his lap as though he had simply decided to rest. Mara buried him herself in the small cemetery behind the Blackrock Miners' Chapel because there was no one else left to do it, and because Silas had taught her, without ever saying so, that a person handles her own grief the way she handles a heavy load, evenly, and without complaint, and without waiting for someone else to help her lift it. She had believed, in the flat way one believes things when there is no reason yet to know better, that the shop and the 2 rooms above it, and the small tin of coins Silas kept behind a loose brick in the chimney would come to her, because she was the only kin he had left in the world, and because she had done a journeyman's work at his side for 3 years without complaint. Wrong as it turned out. In the particular administrative way the world reserves for young women who have not learned yet to ask for anything in writing, Silas had left no will, and no paper naming her as anything at all. A half-brother of Silas's from a marriage nobody in Blackrock had ever heard spoken of arrived from the territorial capital on the 6th day after the burial. A soft-handed man in a checked vest named Otis Pell, carrying a lawyer's letter folded in his breast pocket, and an expression that suggested he had already counted the tools on the wall. He was polite to her. That was the part she would remember later, walking east out of Blackrock with the level in her coat and the road opening out ahead of her. How polite he had been. He had offered her a cup of her own coffee in her own kitchen, and explained, in the slow, careful voice a man uses with a horse he does not trust, that the shop and the stock and the tin behind the chimney brick were now, by law and by blood, his. He had offered her a week to gather her things. He had offered her, when the week was up, $1 for the wheelbarrow she had built herself from scrap the winter before, and he had set the coin down on the workbench and slid it toward her with one finger, and she had not argued, because Silas had taught her without ever saying so that a person who argues from a losing position only teaches the winner how much they have lost. She had signed the paper he put in front of her with the same steady hand she used to sign a repair ticket, and she had thanked him for the coffee, which was hers, and she had gone out to the shed in the last of the afternoon light to begin the business of leaving. There was not, in the end, much to gather. Silas had lived plainly, and she had lived more plainly still. She folded her second dress and her one good shirtwaist into the canvas satchel. She rolled her wool blanket and tied it with a length of harness twine. She took the tin cup and the horn-handled awl and the small flat file she had used every day of her life at Blackrock, because these were her tools and Otis Pell did not know their names. She took the brass hand level out of the drawer where she had kept it wrapped in a handkerchief and slid it into the inner pocket of her coat, and she felt its weight settle there against her ribs like a second heart. She left the tin behind the chimney brick, untouched because the paper she had signed said it was not hers, and she was not a thief, though she thought about it for a long minute standing in front of the hearth with her hand flat against the brick. She slept that last night in the shed on a folded canvas tarp, because Otis Pell had already moved his valise into the room that had been hers for 8 years and shut the door. In the morning she was up before the light. She shouldered the satchel and the blanket roll, and she counted her coin in the gray dark of the yard. $1, the price of a wheelbarrow she had built with her own 2 hands, the whole of her fortune folded into a fold of her coat where the lining had come loose and could be pushed shut again with a thumb. Otis Pell came out onto the landing in his shirt sleeves as she was going through the gate. He said her name once, not unkindly. He asked her where she meant to go. She told him Ironclad, because it was the only railhead town east of Blackrock large enough to need a wheelwright, and because a person asked such a question by a person like Otis Pell ought to have an answer ready. He nodded as though the answer satisfied some private list in his head, and he wished her luck, and he went back inside and shut the door. She did not look back at the shop. She had already done her looking in the shed in the dark, and she did not intend to spend any more of her strength on a building that no longer belonged to her. The road east to Ironclad ran for the better part of 2 days along the grade of an old ore spur, climbing through country the color of rust and ash, and Mara Doyle walked it at a steady pace, because there was no mule to spare and no coin to hire one. Out past the grade, the land had been mined and half abandoned twice over, and the only things that stood taller than a woman's shoulder were the skeletal head frames of shafts long since flooded, black against the sky like the ribs of something that had died standing up. She walked with her hat pulled low and her collar turned up against the grit, and she watched the ground the way Silas had taught her to watch it, reading the cant of the old rail bed for washouts, and the color of the tailings piles for the kind of rock that had once paid and the kind that never had. She stopped at midday to chew a corner of hard bread softened in her mouth, and she stopped again toward evening to fill her canteen at a seep spring Silas had once shown her on a survey trip, because Silas had taught her that water in that country did not announce itself twice. In the early afternoon of the first day, she passed the burned-out remains of a stamp mill that had once served 3 camps at once, its boiler long since hauled away for scrap, and its foundation stones scattered with the thoroughness of men who strip a dead thing down to nothing, rather than leave a single beam standing for someone else to make use of. And she thought, looking at it, that this was what the whole district had become in the 10 years since her father died. A country of things stripped down and left, and men moving on to the next place before the last place had finished dying. Toward the middle of the second day, a family passed her going the opposite direction, riding a mule-drawn cart piled with what looked like the whole of a household's furniture. A woman and 3 children perched atop a chest of drawers and a rolled mattress, and the woman gave her a nod of the particular kind, exchanged between one person who has lost a home and another who plainly has, and neither of them said a word. Because there was nothing in that country that needed saying between 2 women who both understood exactly what the other one was carrying. By the second afternoon, the wind had come up out of the west, carrying grit and the mineral smell of old workings, and her feet had blistered inside boots that had been resoled twice already, and her shoulders ached from the pull of the satchel strap. She thought once of Silas at the workbench with the spoke still clamped in the vise, and she thought of her mother tapping a page in a torn primer, and she thought of her father explaining a level bubble on the porch step in the last of the light. And she did not cry, because crying used water she did not have to spare, and because she had learned long ago that grief was a thing you carried the way you carried a load, distributed evenly and lashed down tight so it would not shift on the grade. She reached the outskirts of Ironclad on the evening of the second day, footsore and down to the last heel of her bread, and she found the town larger and rowdier than Blackrock had ever been, 3 streets of plank and false fronts strung along a rail yard crowded with idle ore cars, the whole place smelling of coal smoke and creosote, and carrying the exhausted quiet of a mining district that had already given up most of what it had to give. That first night she slept behind the feed store with the satchel for a pillow, because $1 did not stretch to a room, and in the morning she went looking for the wheelwright's shop the town was rumored to have, only to learn from a boy sweeping the boardwalk that the shop had closed the year before, when the big Blackwell Consolidated mine had shut its lower levels and half the town had gone with it. There was no work for a wheelwright in a town that had stopped needing wheels. There was, the boy told her, an auction that same morning out at the old Blackwell yard, where the company was selling off what equipment the bank had not already hauled away for scrap value, and a person with $1 to spend might do worse than to see what was going for cheap. Mara Doyle had $1 left in the world and a level in her coat, and 8 years of knowing exactly what a piece of mining iron was worth and exactly what it was not. And so she walked out to the Blackwell yard, because there was nowhere else in that town for her to go, and because $1 spent on nothing was still $1 gone. The boy who had told her about the auction walked partway with her, since he was headed to the yard himself to watch, and told her along the way what little the town remembered of the Blackwell shutdown. That the company had pulled out inside of a month, paying off its debts to the bank in equipment rather than cash, and that the bank had been trying to unload the equipment ever since to anyone willing to haul it away, because scrap iron sitting idle in a yard was worth nothing to a bank that needed the ground cleared to sell. He told her, too, in the offhand way a boy repeats a story he has heard second-hand a dozen times without much interest in whether it is true, that some of the old miners claimed the company had shut the lower levels not because the ore had run out, as the official notices all said, but because the company's own books had gone bad somewhere else entirely, and the Blackwell ground had simply been the easiest asset to write off first. Mara filed the detail away without much weight at the time, the way a person files away any piece of town gossip, and did not think of it again until weeks later, when Garrett Voss's fine coat stepped off the noon train. The Blackwell yard sat at the base of a dead head frame, a half-acre of rusted iron laid out in the mud like the wreckage of something that had once been alive. Broken ore cars, snapped drill steel, coils of cable gone to orange scale, a boiler with its firebox door hanging on one hinge. A crowd of perhaps 30 men had gathered along a rope line, and an auctioneer in a dusty black coat stood on an overturned crate calling lots in a voice gone hoarse from 2 days of shouting. Mara stood at the back of the crowd with her satchel over one shoulder and watched the lots go for pennies on the dollar. A coil of cable here, a bent rail there, a set of drill steel bought by a blacksmith who meant to reforge it into something useful. She had no bid to make on any of it, and she had almost decided to turn back toward town when the auctioneer's man dragged the next lot into the clear ground in front of the rope. It was a mine cart, an ore car, low and squat on 4 iron wheels, its bed caked thick with dried mud and old rust, one side stove in where something heavy had struck it, the coupling pin gone and the whole frame canted a few degrees off true where an axle had bent and never been straightened. Lot 41, the auctioneer called, not troubling to hide his disgust. One busted ore car, good for scrap iron and nothing else. What am I bid? Nobody bid anything. A man near the front laughed and said the company ought to pay somebody to haul it away rather than ask money for it. The auctioneer looked out over the crowd, and his eye caught on Mara Doyle standing at the back in her patched coat with her satchel on her shoulder, and something in his tired face decided to have a little sport. "You there, the girl. You look like you know one end of a wagon from the other. Dollar takes it." There was some laughter at that, because $1 was more than the scrap was worth, and everybody in the yard knew it. And the auctioneer knew it too, and he said it because he was tired, and because it was easier to laugh at a girl than to keep calling an unwanted lot. Mara Doyle did not laugh. She walked to the rope and looked the cart over the way Silas had taught her to look over any piece of iron before she put money down on it, not at the rust, which told her nothing, but at the bones underneath it. And what she saw underneath the rust was a bed built heavier than any ordinary company car had any right to be built. Iron plate doubled at the corners where a standard car used single, and a frame member running the full length of the underside that did not belong to any ore car design she had ever repaired in 8 years at Silas Doyle's bench. She saw, too, wound twice around the rear axle and disappearing up under the canted floorboards, a length of chain gone to the same orange rust as everything else in the yard, padlocked at a joint she could just make out in the shadow beneath the bed. A man beside her at the rope, noticing where her attention had settled, laughed and said she'd do better spending her $1 on a hot meal, since a cart with a bent axle and a stove inside wasn't worth the trouble of dragging it anywhere. Another said the chain was likely just some careless carman's habit, since men who worked a mine for wages had all manner of odd private ways of securing their tools against theft, and a locked chain proved nothing more than that somebody once had been careless enough to leave a shovel where another man might walk off with it. Mara did not answer either of them. She had spent 8 years at Silas Doyle's bench learning that the men who talked loudest and fastest about a piece of iron were rarely the men who had actually knelt down and put a hand on it. And she had learned, too, that a careless habit does not spend a strongbox lock on a padlock, when a length of cheap chain and a common gate hasp would have served exactly as well for keeping honest men out of a tool crib. A strongbox lock was bought for one reason only, and that reason was that whatever it guarded was worth more than the lock itself. And a lock of that quality did not come cheap even new, let alone second-hand off a hardware shelf in a played-out mining town. She had $1. She had at that moment nowhere to sleep that night but behind a feed store, and no trade in a town that no longer wanted her trade. And she had a piece of scrap iron in front of her that made no sense built the way it was built, chained the way it was chained. And every year Silas Doyle had spent teaching her to read iron told her that a thing built heavier than it needed to be, and locked shut underneath, had been built and locked that way on purpose. "I'll take it," she said, and put her last dollar into the auctioneer's hand before the amusement had even left his face. The auctioneer's men were glad enough to be rid of it. Two of them dragged the cart clear of the yard on a length of chain of their own, laughing about the fool girl and her dollar's worth of rust, and left it for her on the open ground beyond the rope, and went back to the auction without a second thought, because to them it was scrap and nothing more, and a fool's dollar was as good as any other dollar. Mara Doyle waited until the crowd had thinned, and moved on to the next lot before she knelt down in the mud beside the canted wheel and looked underneath. The chain was old iron, hand-forged in an era before drawn wire had come cheap to that country, and it had been wound twice around the rear axle, and then run forward along the frame member to a second point near the front wheels, where it looped through a heavy iron staple driven clean through the floor plank and clenched over on the underside. At the joining point, where the two ends of the chain met, hung a padlock the size of a man's fist, its hasp gone to the same rust as everything else. But its body, she saw this only when she scraped a thumbnail across it, stamped faintly with a maker's mark she recognized from a locksmith's catalog Silas had kept on a shelf above the bench. A company that had made strongbox locks, not gate locks, not the cheap padlocks a company bought by the gross to secure a tool shed. Somebody had gone to the trouble and the expense of putting a strongbox lock on a piece of scrap iron nobody, in that yard, thought was worth $1. She worked at the padlock first with the small flat file from her satchel, patiently, the way Silas had taught her to work at anything rusted shut, filing along the hasp rather than forcing it, because forcing rusted iron only snapped it off inside the lock body and made the job twice as hard. It took the better part of an hour, kneeling in the cold mud with the light going gray toward evening, before the hasp parted and the lock fell open in her hand. The chain came free in loops, heavier than she had expected, and beneath it, bolted flush to the underside of the cart bed in a shallow iron cradle built for exactly that purpose, was a strongbox no larger than a bread loaf, its lid sealed at the seam with a bead of tar gone brittle with age, its corners banded in the same heavy iron as the cart frame above it. She sat back on her heels in the mud and did not touch it for a long minute, because she had been raised by two careful people, and then by a third, and none of them had ever taught her to grab. Then she worked the box free of its cradle. It took both hands and the better part of her strength, because whoever had built the cradle had built it to hold, and she carried it to the shelter of a broken ore bin at the edge of the yard, out of the wind, and she set to work on the tar seal with the point of her awl, patient the way a person is patient who means to open a thing without ruining what is inside. The lid came up with a sound like a held breath let go. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, was a canvas pouch that gave under her fingers with the loose, uneven weight raw ore samples always carry. She opened the drawstring and tipped a handful into her palm and saw, even in the failing light, the unmistakable dull yellow gleam of gold running thick through quartz, richer ore than she had ever handled in 8 years of hauling rock at Black Rock. There were perhaps 24 specimens in the pouch, each one wrapped separately in a scrap of paper, and on each scrap was written in a slow, careful hand a number and a depth. Vein B 40 FT, Vein B 60 FT, Vein B 90 FT, assay pending. Beneath the ore pouch lay a folded document, sealed with wax gone brittle and cracked, the paper itself dry and foxed at the edges but whole. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded it under the last of the light, and saw that it was a mining claim, filed and notarized in the proper form, describing a location some 11 miles north of Ironclad along a drainage marked on the paper only as Widow Creek, staked and recorded in the name of one Wendell Cray, and never yet transferred, sold, or contested by any other claimant. And beneath the claim paper, folded once more and tied with a length of waxed thread, was a letter, 4 pages long, written in pencil on the ruled paper of a foreman's daybook, addressed on the outside in the same slow, careful hand to whoever finds this box. She sat down against the broken ore bin in the last strip of daylight, with the wind pulling at the torn canvas of a nearby tent, and the smell of the old workings rising up sweet and mineral around her, and she opened the letter and read. My name is Wendell Cray, and I have worked the Blackwell ground and every ground within 40 miles of it for the better part of 30 years. And if you are reading this then, the company men finally caught up to what I was hiding, and I did not live long enough to come back for it myself. I am writing this by lantern light in the tool shed behind the number 4 shaft, on the night before the company shuts the lower levels for good, and turns every man on this payroll out onto the road with 2 weeks' wages and no more. I have hauled a great many loads of rock in my life, but I have never hauled one I minded losing more than this one, which is why I am writing it down at all, in case the writing outlasts me. The vein I have marked in these samples runs through ground the company surveyed twice and gave up on both times, because their own assessor told them the surface showing was poor and not worth the expense of going deeper. Their own assessor was wrong, or was paid to be wrong, and either way I do not care to guess which, because I found the same vein 40 feet below where the company stopped digging, and it is rich ground, richer than anything Blackwell ever paid a dividend on, and I staked it myself under my own name on my own time, with my own 2 witnesses, and the claim is filed proper at the county seat and owes nothing to any man. I built this cart myself in the machine shop on my own hours, with a false bed and a cradle underneath it built to carry exactly this box, because a company that will cheat its own miners on a paycheck will not think twice about cheating a man out of a claim if they learn he has found what they gave up looking for. I chained the box shut, and I meant to come back for it once the shutdown had blown over and the company men had gone on to some other camp. But I am an old man with a bad chest and a worse cough, and I do not know any more how many more winters I have coming to me, and a man who does not trust his own luck ought to write down what he knows. The claim and the ore in this box are worth more money than I have ever held in one place in my life, and I have no wife and no children of my own to leave it to. But I have a niece, my sister's girl, named Faith Cray, who is 16 this year and living with a widowed aunt in the town of Copperfield, 40 miles south of here, and she has had a harder road than any girl her age ought to have, and she is the only kin I have left in this world worth thinking of. If you are the one who finds this box, I ask you to take the claim to the county recorder and file it proper in Faith Cray's name, or in your own name held in trust for her, whichever the law allows, and to see that she gets the worth of what I found, less whatever honest wage you judge fair for the finding and the carrying, because a person who does the finding has earned something for the doing of it, and I would not have you think otherwise. I do not know who you are, reading this. I only know that whoever went to the trouble of hauling a busted, chained-up ore car out of a scrapyard instead of walking past it is a person who does not give up on a thing easily, and that is the kind of person I would trust with this. My chest is bad tonight and the lantern is near out. I hope, whoever you are, that you found this box in better shape than the company left me in, and I hope you go home from here, wherever home is for you. Wendell Cray, Minor, Blackwell No. 4, the 12th of September. Mara Doyle read the letter through once, and then she read it through again. And when she came the second time to the line about a niece who had had a harder road than any girl her age ought to have, and living with a widowed aunt, and being the only kin worth thinking of, she folded the pages closed against her knee and pressed her palm flat over them and sat for a long while without moving, while the wind pulled at the canvas above her, and the cold came down off the ridge, and the last light went out of the sky. She thought of Silas at the workbench with the spoke still in the vise. She thought of Otis Pell sliding a $1 coin across her own workbench with one finger. She thought of her own 2 dresses folded into a canvas satchel, and a level writing in her coat pocket as the whole of what the world had left her. And she understood, without any drama in the understanding at all, that the box and the chain and the letter had been waiting in the way that certain things wait, for the one person who would know exactly what to do with them and exactly why they mattered. Not so different, she thought, from Faith Cray herself. 16 and living on a widowed aunt's charity was not so far a distance from 18 and sleeping behind a feed store with a satchel for a pillow. She did not know the girl, and never would most likely, but she understood the shape of what Wendell Cray had been afraid of leaving her without, because she had lived inside that same shape herself for the better part of a year. Carefully, she wrapped the letter back in its oilcloth and retied the claim paper with its own thread, and settled the ore pouch back into the box, and she sat with her back against the broken ore bin until full dark, working the problem the same patient way Silas had once taught her to work any hard problem, sorting what the honest course of action actually was from what the easy one might have been. The easy course would have been to walk to Widow Creek herself quietly and say nothing to anyone, and stake the vein new in her own name, because Wendell Cray was dead, and there was no one left to say the claim in the box had ever existed at all. She thought about it, in fact, for a long minute, sitting there in the dark with the box heavy against her knees. But Silas had raised her too carefully for that particular kind of easy to sit right in her, and so had a father who had built his whole trade on telling a company the truth about a grade even when the truth cost the company money. And she found, in the end, that she did not want the vein badly enough to become the kind of person who would take it that way. In the morning she went looking for the county recorder's office, and was directed instead to the assay office on Ironclad's Main Street, a low plank building with a tin awning on the color of a nickel, where the recorder's business was handled on alternate days by the Asser himself, a man named Abel Crenshaw. Crenshaw was a small, square-shouldered man of about 60 with white eyebrows and permanent ink stains on the fingers of his right hand, and when Mara Doyle laid the claim paper open on his counter and set the letter beside it, he read the 4 pages without speaking, and then he took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose and said only, "Wendell Cray. I knew that man 20 years, bought half his samples through this office. He's dead then. He wrote it 2 years back, near as I can tell by the paper," Mara said. "I found it chained under a cart the company sold for scrap yesterday, out at the Blackwell yard." Crenshaw sat with that for a moment, and then he asked her, in the plain way a man asks a question he already half expects the answer to, whether she meant to file the claim in her own name. "In Faith Cray's name," Mara said, "or held for her if the law wants it done that way. He asked for a fair finder's wage for whoever brought it in, and I mean to take that and nothing more." Crenshaw looked at her a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has not seen in a while and had stopped expecting to see again, and said only that was well spoken. He locked the office and took her to the back room, where he weighed the ore samples on his beam scale, one at a time, and read the assays off a hand press he kept for exactly this purpose. And by the time he had finished, he had gone quiet in a different way than before, and he told her plainly that the samples she had brought him assayed richer than anything that had come out of the Blackwell ground in the whole 30 years he had run that scale. He wrote the claim into the county book that same afternoon, held in trust for Faith Cray of Copperfield, minor, under a guardianship he himself agreed to stand witness for until she came of age, and he counted out from the value of the ore samples alone a finder's wage of $200 in coin, and wrote it into his ledger under Mara Doyle's name, which he asked her to spell for him, and she did. That same afternoon she stood in the sheriff's office and gave her account plainly to a deputy named Hollis Vane, who wrote her words down in a bound book and had her sign beneath his own name, which she did with the same steady hand that had signed Otis Pell's paper on the workbench at Blackrock. Crenshaw asked her, before she left the office that first evening, why she had not simply kept the ore samples quiet and staked the ground new in her own name, since Wendell Cray was 2 years dead, and there was no one left alive to say for certain the box had ever existed at all before she opened it. It was a fair question, and he asked it plainly, without any accusation in it, the way one careful person tests another careful person's reasoning before deciding how much trust to extend. Mara told him what she had already worked out for herself, sitting against the ore bin in the dark the night before. That her own father had spent his whole working life telling companies the truth about a grade even when the truth cost him standing, and that Silas had spent 8 years teaching her the same lesson without ever once putting it into so many words, and that she did not think either man would have thanked her for building a fortune on a lie of omission, however easy the lie would have been to tell, and however unlikely anyone was ever to catch her in it. She said, too, that a girl who had been left with nothing by one set of careless men had no wish to become the kind of person who left a girl in Copperfield with nothing by the same carelessness, only dressed up finer. Crenshaw did not say much in reply to that, only nodded slowly and turned back to his ledger, but he treated her differently from that afternoon forward, and within the week he had begun teaching her the beam scale without her having to ask. That same evening, Deputy Hollis Vane happened by the office on an unrelated matter of town business, and stayed to hear the tail end of the conversation, and told her afterward, walking her back toward the feed store in the last light, that he had seen a great many people pass through his office over 6 years wearing a badge in that town, and most of them, given the same chance Mara had been given that morning to walk quietly away with a fortune nobody living, could have proven she did not honestly stake herself, would have taken it without a second thought, and slept soundly after. He did not say it as flattery, exactly, only as a plain observation of the kind Silas Doyle himself might have made, and Mara found she believed him more for the plainness of it than she would have believed a more generous compliment. By the next day it was known in Ironclad that the girl who had bought a busted ore car for $1 at the Blackwell auction had found a chained strongbox worth a fortune underneath it, and by the day after that, it was known that she had filed the whole of it in trust for a dead miner's niece in another town, and asked for nothing but an honest wage for the finding. Abel Crenshaw sent a rider north to Widow Creek to confirm the vein against the samples, and rode himself, 3 days later, with the deputy and 2 witnesses, to walk the claim boundary and drive fresh stakes over Wendell Cray's rotted originals, And what they found when they reached the 40-foot mark Cray had written into his samples made even Crenshaw, who had assayed rock for 30 years and thought himself past being surprised by it, take his hat off without quite knowing why he had done it. The vein ran wider and richer than the samples alone had promised, and within the month, a syndicate out of the territorial capital had leased development rights from the trust at a figure that made grown men on the ironclad boardwalk go quiet when they heard the number spoken aloud. And a share of that figure, set aside by the terms Crenshaw had written into the trust papers, went north to Copperfield with a rider and a letter explaining, as plainly as Mara Doyle could make it, that her uncle had loved her and had thought of her, and had built a cart with his own hands to hide a fortune meant for no one else but her. Mara Doyle took a room above the feed store where she had once slept for free behind the sacks, paying $2 a week out of her finder's wage, with a window that faced north toward the ridge she had walked in on. Verna Holt, the widow who ran the boarding kitchen 2 doors down, gave her a place at the long table without asking questions, and set down in front of her the first hot supper she had eaten since Sela's, which was beef and beans and cornbread cut in wedges from an iron skillet. Ambrose Teal, the town's one remaining blacksmith, took the old ore cart into his own yard and straightened its bent axle and reset its canted wheel without charge, saying only that a thing that had carried a fortune that far deserved better iron under it than it had. The Reverend Aldous Whitmore walked her out to the town cemetery on the rise above the rail yard and showed her a plot of unbroken ground, in case she ever wished to have Wendell Cray reinterred there properly, since he had died and been buried, she learned, in an unmarked pauper's row when the company shut the camp, and no kin had come forward to claim him. Crenshaw offered her a stool in the back of the assay office and taught her, over the following weeks, to read a beam scale to a quarter grain and to test a bar of raw ore against a black touchstone. And within a month, she was keeping his ledgers in her own steady hand under his eye. And within 2 months, she was signing small receipts on his authority when business called him away. She wrote to Faith Cray in Copperfield a plain letter that said only that her uncle had loved her, and had built a cart with his own 2 hands rather than let a company cheat her out of what he had found, and had thought of her every day of the 2 years since, right up until the letter he wrote by lantern light with a bad chest and a lantern near out. Faith Cray wrote back a longer letter than Mara had expected, in a careful, grateful hand, and Mara folded it and kept it in the oilcloth beside Wendell Cray's own letter, and read both again sometimes on quiet evenings, though she never told anyone she did. In the same season, and at her own request, Reverend Whitmore arranged for Wendell Cray's remains to be moved from the unmarked pauper's row, where the company had left him, to the plot of unbroken ground on the rise above the rail yard, and Mara Doyle paid for the new stone out of her own finder's wage, over Crenshaw's mild objection that the trust would gladly have covered the expense. She wanted the stone to come from her own pocket, she told him, because a man who had built a cart with his own 2 hands rather than trust a company to deal fairly with him deserved a marker paid for by somebody who understood exactly what that stubbornness had cost him, and what it had in the end made possible. She chose the words herself, after turning several drafts over in her mind on the walk out to the cemetery and back. Wendell Cray, miner, 30 years honest to the ground and to the people who came after him. Faith Cray traveled up from Copperfield with her aunt for the small service Reverend Whitmore held over the new stone, and it was the first time Mara Doyle and Faith Cray stood in the same place together. 2 girls who had each been left with nothing by the ordinary carelessness of the world, and had each, in their separate ways, been given something back by a man who had refused to let that carelessness be the end of the story. There was, too, a quieter kind of integration that no one in town ever remarked on aloud, though Mara noticed it herself well enough. The women who had once looked past her on the boardwalk, the way people look past anyone whose circumstances make them uncomfortable to look at directly, began instead to nod to her by name, and to ask after the trust and after Faith Cray's welfare as though the girl in Copperfield were a distant niece of the whole town's collective making. The single men who boarded at Verna Holt's table, who had at first regarded her as an oddity in the same way they might have regarded a talking mule, began instead to defer to her judgment on any question involving iron or ore or a fair day's wage, because a girl who had turned $1's worth of scrap into a fortune for someone else, purely out of a stubborn insistence on doing right by a dead man's wishes, was not a person whose opinion a sensible man dismissed twice. Ambrose Teal, some weeks after he had reset the cart's bent axle without charge, brought the whole rig back to her fitted with a new coupling pin and a fresh coat of pitch to keep the rust from creeping back in, and told her, gruffly and without meeting her eye, that a woman ought to have a decent cart under her if she meant to keep working iron in that town, and that he would hear no argument about the charge because there was none to be made. She kept the cart in a shed behind the feed store, half as a tool and half, though she would not have said so aloud to anyone, as a kind of monument to the dollar that had changed the whole shape of her life. And on slow afternoons at the assay office, she sometimes walked back to look at it, running a hand along the iron plate at the corner where Wendell Cray had doubled the metal for a reason only he had understood at the time. Abel Crenshaw, for his part, began that same season to speak of retiring within the year, and to speak of it more and more often, in the unhurried way an older man speaks when he has already decided who ought to take over his ledgers and is only waiting for the right season to say so plainly. He taught her, beyond the beam scale and the touchstone, the finer points of a fire assay, the crucible work and the cupellation that separated a rich sample from a poor one beyond any doubt a customer might raise. And he began, without much ceremony, to let her sign the office's formal assay certificates under her own name rather than his, a thing he had done for no other assistant in the 30 years he had kept that office. By the end of her third month in Ironclad, people on the street spoke her name when they passed her. Verna Holt saved her the heel of the cornbread. Ambrose Teal touched his hat brim to her outside the smithy. Children who had heard the story pointed at her from doorways until their mothers told them to stop, and the story they had heard, passed from porch to porch the way such stories travel, was always the same story. That a homeless girl with $1 to her name had bought a piece of rusted junk nobody else would touch, and had found a fortune chained underneath it, and had given every dollar of it away to a girl she had never met, because it had never once occurred to her that the honest thing and the easy thing were the same thing. The trouble came, as trouble in that country generally did, dressed in a good coat and carrying paper of its own. It was near the end of Mara's second month at the assay office that a man arrived off the noon train from the territorial capital, a lean, clean-shaven man named Garrett Voss, wearing a coat too fine for the mud of Ironclad's one street, and carrying a leather portfolio under his arm, the way another man might carry a weapon. He gave his card to Abel Crenshaw as a claims representative of the Blackwell Consolidated Mining Company, and he asked, in a voice pitched carefully between courtesy and threat, to see the trust papers filed the month before in the name of one Faith Cray. Crenshaw showed him the papers because the law required him to show them to any party with a claim to make, and Voss read them through twice, standing at the counter, and then he laid his own document down beside them. An option agreement, dated 11 years back and signed by a company surveyor long since retired, granting Blackwell consolidated first right of purchase on any mineral discovery made within the Widow Creek drainage for a term of 20 years, on the grounds that the company had surveyed the ground first and had never formally released its interest in it. Mr. Cray was our employee when he staked that claim, Voss said. Whatever he found under our name, on ground we optioned, belongs to the company that paid his wages. I am prepared to have this trust set aside and the claim transferred to Blackwell Consolidated, with a fair settlement made to the girl in Copperfield, of course, out of simple decency. The alternative is a court matter that will take a year and cost the girl every dollar of it in lawyers' fees before a judge ever sees the papers. He said all of this in the mild, reasonable tone of a man who has said the same speech in the same words to a dozen other small claimants in a dozen other towns, and had watched, each time, the fight go out of them somewhere around the phrase court matter that will take a year, because most people without money enough to hire a lawyer of their own could not afford to find out whether the threat was real. It was a good speech. It had worked before. Mara Doyle, who happened to be at the back counter weighing a set of samples when Voss arrived, set down her scale weights and came forward and asked to see the option paper for herself. She read it the way Silas had taught her to read any contract before she signed her name near one, not for what it said outright, but for what it left carefully unsaid. And she found, on the second reading, exactly the thing she had suspected might be there. The option granted the company first right of purchase on any discovery made by a company surveying party within the drainage during the term of the option. It said nothing at all about a discovery made by an individual miner staking ground on his own time, off the company clock, under his own name, which was precisely what Wendell Cray's letter, and the notarized claim filed with it, both plainly stated he had done. Your option covers ground your own surveyors walked, she said. It doesn't cover a claim a man staked with his own witnesses on his own hours, after your surveyors already walked that same ground and told the company it wasn't worth the expense of digging deeper. Mr. Cray wrote that down himself in his own hand, the night before your company shut the camp. If your surveyors had found what he found, the company would have kept those levels open. They didn't. That's not an oversight I think a judge is likely to overlook. Voss's mild courtesy thinned considerably at that, and for a moment something harder showed underneath it, the way the rust had thinned on the cart bed to show iron built heavier than it needed to be. He said that a girl with $1's worth of scrap iron and a dead miner's letter was not in a strong position to lecture a company attorney about mining law, and Abel Crenshaw, who had stood quietly through all of it with his ink-stained hands folded on the counter, said in a voice gone suddenly flat and final that he had witnessed and notarized Wendell Cray's original claim filing 11 years before, in this very office, and that he would say exactly that under oath to any judge in the territory who cared to ask him, and that Mr. Voss was welcome to bring his court matter, because Abel Crenshaw had been keeping honest books in that town for 30 years, and did not care to spend whatever years he had left watching a company take a dead man's legacy away from a living girl on a technicality dressed up as decency. He left on the evening train without his portfolio open again, but his manner was not empty-handed either. It was the manner of a man who intends to come back with more paper and less patience, and for a week afterward Ironclad talked of little else, and Mara Doyle slept lightly, and kept Wendell Cray's letter and the notarized claim both inside the oilcloth in the drawer beside her bed rather than at the office, because a fire was an easy thing to arrange for a company that did not want a paper trail examined too closely. The company's court matter never materialized. What arrived instead, 3 weeks later, was a second letter, this one from the territorial capital, from an attorney representing Blackwell Consolidated's own board of directors, informing Abel Crenshaw's office that the company wished to withdraw any claim of interest in the Widow Creek Trust, and that Mr. Voss's visit had not been authorized at the level the board considered proper for a matter of this size. Deputy Hollis Vane, who had ridden up to the Capitol himself in the interval to lodge a formal complaint on Mara's behalf, came back with a harder piece of the story than the polite letter let on. That Blackwell Consolidated's own surveyor, the one who had told the company the Widow Creek ground was not worth the expense 11 years before, had been quietly let go from 3 different companies since, each time after a vein he had judged worthless turned out in someone else's hands to be rich, and that the board had decided, on hearing the details of the Cray claim laid out plainly, that a public court fight against a homeless orphan girl who had given away a fortune to a dead miner's niece was a fight they stood to lose twice over, once in the courtroom and once in every newspaper in the territory. Mara Doyle heard all of this from Crenshaw's own mouth, standing at the back counter with a set of scale weights still in her hand, and she found that the news settled in her the way the Levels bubble settled after a long haul, not with any triumph in it, only with the plain, quiet satisfaction of a thing finally sitting true. On an evening in the 4th month, Mara Doyle climbed the outside stair to her room above the feed store and sat down on the edge of the cot, with the window open to the ridge. The country she had walked in on lay out there under a darkening sky, and the smith's hammer had gone quiet an hour before, and the smell of Verna Holt's supper was drifting up faint from below. On the little pine table she had bought for $1.40, she laid out the 2 things that mattered. She laid out the brass hand level with the chipped glass vial, the level Silas Doyle had carried in his coat pocket for the better part of 30 years, and had put into her palm at the workbench when she was 15, saying nothing at all in the giving of it. She set it down carefully, and watched the bubble settle dead center over the grain of the pine, and closed her hand over it a moment before letting it be. Beside the level she laid a small iron ore hammer with a worn ash handle, the one tool from Wendell Cray's tool shed that Abel Crenshaw had sent along with the last of the paperwork, saying that a woman who had found a man's whole fortune under a chain ought to have something of his own hands to keep if she wanted it. She had wanted it. She set it an inch from the level, so that the 2 objects lay together on the pine, and she looked at them a long time. 2 things from 2 men who had never met each other and would never meet her as she was now, and both of whom had, in their separate ways, refused to leave a girl with nothing. She thought of Silas at the workbench with the spoke still clamped in the vise. She thought of Wendell Cray writing by lantern light with a bad chest and 2 weeks left on a company payroll, thinking of a niece in Copperfield he would not live to see grow up. She thought of Otis Pell sliding a single dollar coin across a workbench that had once been hers, believing he had taken everything worth taking, and she found that she could think of Otis Pell now without any anger at all, only a small remote pity, because he had signed a paper for a shop and a tin of coin behind a chimney brick, and believed he had taken the whole of her inheritance, and he had not. He had not taken the level. He had not taken 8 years of Silas Doyle's teaching. He had not taken her steady hand, or her patience with a rusted lock, or her eye for iron built heavier than it needed to be, or her stubborn refusal to grab at a thing that was not hers to grab. He had not, in the end, taken anything that could not be replaced, and he had missed entirely the one thing he could never have known was hers to find, because it had not existed yet on the day he sent her out the gate. She thought, too, of Garrett Voss standing at the assay counter in his fine coat with his portfolio of paper, so certain that a claim of ownership written in a company's careful legal language would always outweigh a claim written in pencil, by a dying man's own hand in a tool shed by lantern light. She had felt, in the moment of reading his option agreement, the particular cold drop in the stomach of a person watching everything she had built threaten to come apart on a technicality she had not thought to guard against. And she understood now, sitting at the pine table with the level and the ore hammer laid out before her, that the fear had taught her something Silas's 8 years of patient instruction never quite had occasion to teach. That the honest course of action was not always the safe one, and a person who meant to hold to it anyway had to be willing to stand at a counter and argue a point of law against a man paid a great deal more than she was, on nothing but the strength of having read the paper more carefully than he expected her to. Conflict was not something she naturally enjoyed, and she did not imagine she ever would. But she found, turning the level over once in her palm and watching the bubbles slide and settle, that she was not especially afraid of it either, not anymore. Not since Voss's fine coat had gone out on the evening train and never come back, and she thought that this, too, was a kind of inheritance Silas and Wendell Cray had left her between them, though neither man had ever met the other, and neither had lived to see what she had done with what they gave her. Downstairs, Verna Holt called up the stair that supper was on the table, and Mara Doyle answered that she was coming. She stood at the window a moment longer. Below her, the street was nearly empty. A dog crossed at an angle in the last light, and a lamp was being lit in the window of the assay office, where Abel Crenshaw sometimes worked late over the trust ledger she had written in her own careful hand. She put the level back into the inner pocket of her coat, where it had ridden for 30 miles of rust and ash and dead head frames, and she set the ore hammer on the shelf above her cot where she would see it first thing every morning, and she went down to eat. Mara Doyle was 18, and she had been homeless with a single silver dollar folded into the lining of her coat, and she had spent that dollar on a rusted mine cart nobody else in the yard would touch. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story stayed with you, if you sat down inside it, the way Mara Doyle sat down at that pine table with her 2 small tools laid out in front of her, take a moment now to subscribe and to share this story with someone who has been told they had nothing left worth counting. Because those are the people who most need to hear how a girl with $1 and a chipped brass level bought a piece of rust nobody wanted, and found a chain underneath it worth cutting, and became, in the space of one honest season, the person a whole town greeted by name on the street. And before you go, sit with this question a little while, the way the narrator has been sitting with it. What has someone tried to convince you was worthless, that turned out, once you looked underneath it, to be the very thing that changed everything? And what did you carry in your own pocket out of a room you were told to leave, that turned out to be worth more than everything they thought they had kept? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you're willing, what you carried out. We read every of them. End of all paragraphs. Total 154 paragraphs extracted.